Yeah, the first time I met Anthony was 2008. I don't know if you remember, Anthony. It was a stat exam that I had to take to be a training course director.
I remember.
And to be quite honest, Anthony was the only friendly face in the room. You know, everyone was really serious. And I remember you coming up to me afterwards and saying something, a few words, and it was just very human. So, and ever since then, we've had some contact through the congresses and conventions, and every time and also we do a meeting every year in Germany, and we got to know each other fairly well. And Anthony's been over to the training course to teach here as well. So I'm really delighted he has offered to talk to you all about his introduction to the use of the self, which I personally think is a bit of genius writing. I really like it. Yeah, I have, it just brings it much more onto an emotional and human level.
I enjoyed writing it. It took about 30 or 40 different drafts. I was originally asked by the publishers to write an introduction that would appeal to a new generation of Alexander readers. And that was a really, really difficult task, because I also knew that the Alexander book, this book, The Use of the Self, is pretty much standard and obligatory reading by every single Alexander student in the world. So I knew that my audience was going to be twofold. It was going to be students and teachers of the Alexander technique for the next 20 years until the next new publishing of this classic book, and also people that have heard of the Alexander technique, or maybe not even heard of it, but want to get an introduction to it. And my task really was, how could I inspire a new generation of people that can read about the technique without being put off by rather arcane Victorian language? I mean, Alexander's not an easy read at the best of times, and this book is no exception. So I wanted to really make it relevant to a new generation, and at the same time provoke some questions for an existing generation of Alexander teachers and students. So if you'd like to either, if you feel shy, you can post them in the chat, or you can read out a question, or you can spontaneously jump in and ask me anything about some of the ideas in this introduction and where I'm coming from. And you can challenge anything I say. I certainly won't be offended. Yes?
Yeah. One was about what's your view on teaching just with the voice?
Right. Yes.
Whether online or local, doesn't matter, but how do you see that?
Yes, so teaching with the voice. So as many of you may know, as a result of the lockdown, I decided to offer some Alexander work online, which obviously is without touch. And I'll go into that a little bit now. It may be helpful. So first of all, let's have a think together. What does it mean by use of the self? Well, the use of the self is the way I'm looking after myself or not as I'm talking to you. That's the use of myself. How I'm talking to you. It's the how of my behavior, the how of my talking, the how of my gesturing, not the content. The content is either clever or stupid, but the quality, the way I'm delivering it, is my use of self. And I hope it's clear to everybody that the use of the self is primary. And the content, the stuff I'm talking about, however wise or ridiculous, is secondary. So what is use of the self? Use of the self right now is communicated through my voice, obviously. If I'm upset and distressed, my voice will reflect that. I think that's quite clear to all of us. If I was touching you and I was in a hurry, or agitated, or very, very careful, or very ambitious, or trying to get rid of some pain or ache you might be suffering from, you'd feel that in my hands. It couldn't be otherwise. It would communicate through my touch. If I was depressed right now, it would communicate through my gesture, my postural patterns. The eyes are the windows to the soul. You'd see stuff going on in my eyes if I'm frightened. So it's not a surprise to say that the use of the self is a total mind-body expression. And ideally, I like to convey my use of self, my way of being in this world, for better or for worse, via my hands. That's my favorite means of communication. I've been doing it since 1982, when I first moved into the Alexander training course. And it's direct. There's a lot of beauty in the Alexander touch, as you can read from the introduction. I think there's nothing to quite match the Alexander touch through the hands. When it's working well, it's exquisite. But then what happens in the absence of touch? What happens in the absence of physical touch? And I raise it as a question to everybody. Can you be touched by the presence of somebody else? Can you be touched by a beautiful view? I'm certainly not saying I'm a beautiful view, so perhaps I'll scrap that one. But can you be touched by music? Of course you can. Can you be touched by someone's kindly presence? Yes. Can you be touched by a gesture? Of course you can. We all know that. Humans interact, and when they're not touching, they still communicate from who they are and their state of mind-body. So I had to think very carefully about what I could do and what I couldn't do via the screen. And just as there are many ways of teaching Alexander with touch, there are many ways of teaching Alexander without touch. And my understanding of the way I want to teach without touch is totally consistent to the way I want to teach it with touch. And I'll just flesh that out a little bit. The way I teach with touch is for my primary communication to be via my hands. I want to, in Alexander words, give you an experience or a new experience through touch. That I don't overly emphasize instructing you to achieve something with words, which are secondary. So primary is the communication through touch, through my being, through the quality of my mind-body, through my attitude of self. That's the use of the self. I want to convey, what do I want to convey through use of self? Well, many things. I want to convey that I'm not judging you. I want to convey that I accept you just the way you are. I want to convey I'm not here to fix you. I want to convey that I'm here and awake and alive to your reality. I want to convey that I'm not intruding into your space, that I'm staying back from your dramas at the same time as receiving you into my awareness. I want to convey that I'm not overly trying to achieve results. In our jargon, I'm not overly endgaining. I want to convey that I'm not overly concentrating on a small part of you to the exclusion of everything about you, the whole rather than the part. I want to convey that I'm reasonably mindful and attentive and engaged and awake rather than scattered and mind-wandering. I want to convey that I can cope with my emotional reality and yours rather than backing off and bracing or sinking into a depression. All of those things are communicated through and via my use of self. And my use of self connects with your use of self through a meeting. And the Alexander session is a meeting of two people, sometimes more, usually via touch. So when I decided to open up my Zoom sessions for people, it was very, very clear to me that the only way I wanted to teach the Alexander technique was, as I said, totally consistent with my hands-on work, which is I wanted to only or primarily communicate my use of self from me to you, and receive your use of self from you to me via the screen without touch. And what vehicles or media have I got for that communication? Well, I've got my voice, I've got my gestures, I've got my facial expression, my eyes, and that sort of undefinable sense of presence. That communicates across the divide. And it's the same Anthony that would put hands on you. In other words, there shouldn't be any separation between the quality of my physical touch and the communication that you receive from my voice and my gestures and my presence. Because Anthony can't split himself up into 3 different Anthonys at the same time. It has to be consistent because we are whole. And that's the way I decided to teach. It's the only way I could teach while being faithful to my understanding of what Alexander is. Now, of course, I know there are many Alexanders in town, many Alexander techniques. Some techniques prioritize, think about this, visualize this, sense this, more using the playfulness of the mind to achieve different results, affirmations, imaginations, visualizations, evoking memories. That's all very legitimate. It can change consciousness. But that would perhaps, if I'm not careful, place those mind games at the center of the stage, and the use of the self as maybe a passenger in the car. And I wanted to always make sure that my communication was primarily a use of self-communication. So the dangers I feel, both with hands-on and without hands-on, of communicating via primarily imagination, sensory suggestions, memories, affirmations, is that it can evoke a multitude of responses. If I say, imagine your head's a balloon, for some people they may start to do this, other people might start to do this, other people may do nothing at all, just imagine without doing anything. I've got no control over suggestions, which is why one of the reasons why Alexander said don't use imagination as a vehicle for direction, because it's labile, it's open to multiple interpretations. You can be spot on sometimes and it can be very creative, or you can miss. But with touch, you can't miss. With use of self to use of self, you can't miss. There's no hiding place. And that's the way I wanted to build my Zoom work, from use of self to use of self.
Anthony, the thing I'm a bit not really clear about is when you're teaching with the voice,
yes,
only, especially online, you don't have feedback. You don't really know what's going on with the other person. You can only guess. And that's what I find a bit tricky. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, it's a great point. Well, you say feedback, so you're talking about sensory feedback, aren't you? Under your hands, you can start to detect, oh, there's a reaction or there isn't a reaction. What is the feedback we're all looking for as Alexander teachers?
For tension, you're sensing tension, but how can you see tension?
Well, you might sense, yes, very good. So you might sense, sometimes you might sense tension, or you might sense too little tension. You might sense a change in tension. It's not just tone you're looking for. I would say that what you're looking for as an Alexander teacher in terms of the feedback question you're asking, and it's a very appropriate question, is you're looking for reactions to stimuli.
Yeah.
You're not looking for tension by itself, because this is tension, but it's not a problem. So tension by itself is not an issue. I can use more tension and less tension because it's appropriate. I can, you know, lift up a heavy suitcase and my muscles will be bulging. That's fine. But Alexander wasn't interested in tension. He was interested in reactions to stimuli. And how do you know if I've reacted to stimuli? Well, to give you an example, a stimulus comes along like a loud bang, and I'll go, now, would you say the problem is the tension in my neck? Or would you say the problem is Anthony's reacted to the stimulus of the loud noise unavoidably with a brace and a flight, and it's my total mind and body that's gone into a reaction? That you're not just interested in a little bit of tension here, or a bit of pull up of the chest, or a little bit of tightening of the shoulders, or my hands going like this. You're interested in all of Anthony, and all of Anthony's gone into a reaction. Some muscles have gone too tense, and some other ones, oppositional to those muscles, have probably gone overly relaxed. That puts them out of commission. So the issue is, and you ask the question, where's the feedback? Well, all of you are trained to use your eyes for observation. And if you look at Alexander's history, he repeatedly said to his students, use your observation, use mirrors. Alexander used mirrors. He didn't have anyone to feel what's going on with him. He had mirrors. He needed to learn how to observe. And that is really, really important. And you can also learn to observe and detect through observation, not just palpation, which is touch, but observation. Is a pupil reacting or not reacting to the stimulus that you're offering? That's the key of an Alexander teacher. Does that make sense? You can see a reaction or non-reaction. You can see it in the eyes, in the face, in the jaw, in the body. You can see it everywhere. I'm sure all of you already are noticing and observing reactions all the time in your classes. It's unavoidable. Yeah. So when you're on Zoom, and you're asking them to do things, and you're communicating quietness and stillness and non-doing and openness and non-judging, and they can't get anything wrong, all the most important ingredients of an Alexander lesson, not evoking the fear reflexes, helping a person feel safe, acknowledged. They're coming into this Zoom room, and they have this new experience of a relationship with you that is quite different to normal education, where they feel they've got to try or try harder to achieve. They've got to please you. All of these things you're picking up on, and you're stripping them away. There's nothing to get right. There's no right movement. There's no right shape for the neck and head. There's no right primary control. There's no right directions. There's no right movement. You can't fail or succeed. There's nothing to do. And they can spontaneously just take a breath and just feel, you know what, I feel safer here than I've felt in any other teaching environment, because my end gaining buttons are not being pressed by an ambitious teacher who's forcing me to please him, who's pushing me to collude with his ambitions and his end gainings. And that is real. That's a real communication. So everything you do on Zoom, or even in a real Alexander lesson of touch, you're helping shift an attitude, not a body. You're not really shifting bodies. You may move a body, but you're not a body worker. You're a psychophysical teacher. You're communicating something about how you're living in this world and how you embrace the reality of another person without evoking fear and anxiety and terror. And that goes to the heart of what you're doing. And you can use movements, sitting and standing, as a stimulus with all means. Of course you can. You can ask them to lift up a violin or recite a Shakespeare poem or horse ride. You might find it difficult to get a horse into your teaching room, but the principle's the same. You can ask them to do anything you like. There's nothing holy about sitting and standing or any activity, but it's the quality. And if you take away their trying, this is why I wrote about this in the use of the self, the introduction. It's the trying mind that's the problem. And if you can neutralize the trying mind, you get a very different quality of being, a very, very different use of self, which will totally shift the way they move, the way they talk, and the way they experience themselves. That is visible, not just sensitive, sensible. It's all there in front of you. So yes, you can get huge amounts of feedback from being in front of another person on Zoom. And what are you looking for? Well, you're looking for these subtle shifts of reaction. So that's a subtle shift. That's a subtle shift, but it's not so subtle, I'm exaggerating it just to make my point. But everybody here can see the shifts of reaction as a result of the stimulus inside of me that I'm not able to inhibit, that I'm not able to manage or cope with. Inhibition is just a grandiose Alexander term to describe whether we are managing to cope with something or whether something's overwhelming. It's not a fancy thing that's invented by Alexander. It's a human attribute that describes whether we are either overwhelmed by an experience or what we manage to hold it and be okay with it. And what we're looking for in Alexander is to be more okay with stuff and not to be overly challenged into patterns of reaction that end up causing symptoms that then lead us to seek out a therapeutic response, hopefully an Alexander teacher. I'm exposing my bias.
I just have a quick question about what you just said. You said that when you notice their engaining reactions, and when it is related with their psychological state.
Yes.
Do you say things directly sometimes or ask questions?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing, and I probably see this as the most important part of all my teaching, is I do the best I can not to evoke fear in another person. So there are certain lines of questioning where they can feel that I'm somehow judging the response or judging the reaction, and then I've failed my task. Because they'll try very hard not to do it again, which is a disaster, or try and do something differently with effort, or freeze with terror of having just displeased me. So it depends what you mean by questioning, but sometimes I will ask a question. I say, what's that like? Or I might say that looks rather difficult. Or to acknowledge a reality. I might see a little tear coming out of the corner of an eye. So that looks rather sad. But I won't ask a question that implies a judgment, a criticism, or anything that amplifies their desire to gain their end, to achieve something, to succeed, because they'll just use their trying mind to achieve it, rather than the letting mind, the allowing mind, the mind of, you could say, surrender, the mind that isn't pushing and pulling itself and distorting itself, but the mind that says it's okay. And in that state of mind-body, we all function better. And your job as an Alexander teacher, in the way I see it, is to create the conditions where the distortions of the over-trying mind are minimized so that the non-trying self, the alive, vital, non-trying, safe self can win, and not the other one. And that's the same with all of the Alexander habits. You have to create the ground conditions where those habits are no longer necessary because they're safe enough in your presence not to activate them as coping mechanisms. Does that answer the question, Sudha?
Yes, it helps. Thank you.
I do hope that you haven't already answered this in what you've just said, but I'd like to ask you, I'm really interested in that quality of non-doing that you talk about, how it's really not possible to not react to the stimulus of everyday life. And that came as a big relief to me, because I thought, wow, there was really no chance that I'd be able to inhibit some of my reactions because they just happen just like that. And I wondered whether part of this quality of non-doing is being able to choose how we react to a reaction, sort of not minding it. I don't know if you've already answered that, so I'm sorry.
I haven't, and it's a very pertinent question. So if you've read the little introduction, you'll know that I don't believe in the idea that you can choose not to react. I don't buy the Alexander choice myth. It doesn't make sense to me personally. In other words, if my kids, I've got kids, an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, when they press my buttons, which they do frequently, and I scream at them, I haven't chosen to scream or shout. They've just pushed a button and I've gone, and they're fighting each other, and I've just come in there and I've lost it for a moment. And I've reacted. It's not Anthony at his best. It's just a fact. I've reacted. I didn't choose it. So the moments when the stimulus wins, when it's too big for me, something dangerous is happening, I've just gone into a number. I mean, hopefully not too often, but say a road rage or a trolley rage or a whatever it is, a kid's rage, when I'm taken over by my reactions to a stimulus, I haven't chosen it. So the idea that I could choose not to react like that is a myth because it's happened. Now, then you're asking a very interesting question. What can I then do about that reaction? Well, I can only do something about any reaction the moment I've calmed down enough to notice that I've just reacted. So what comes first? The second I've just calmed down enough to say, goodness, Anthony, you just were on a number for 5 seconds, you just flipped. At that moment, it's not like, and now I choose not to react to it. I'm already back home. I've already recovered. So the idea of choice at that moment makes no sense. I understand what you're saying, that it seems like I'm then choosing not to react to the reaction. And in a way, I'm not reacting to the reaction, but not because I'm choosing not to, but because I've already calmed down. So it almost like something's burnt itself out and I'm calmer. I'm back home. I'm back to a reasonably harmonious use of myself. So the point is this: if I'm not disturbed by a stimulus right now, say like stage fright, having to talk to all of you guys, I'm not choosing not to react to the stimulus. I'm finding myself not reacting because it's not, you're not overly pushing my buttons. You can try a little bit harder with a real difficult question and we'll see how I go. But at the moment, I'm not overly reacting to the stimulus of your questions. If you insult me and I go, I don't like that sort of question, then the reaction's happened. It may take over my use of self for 2 or 3 seconds. I'd recover. And at that moment, I'm looking after myself. I'm okay. I'm back home. I'm still not choosing anything. It's just that the stimulus isn't big enough to throw me into a reaction. So I don't believe choice ever really comes into it. If you're saying, can I choose behavior? The answer is, I can only choose my behavior when I'm not reacting. In the middle of flipping, when I've lost my temper, in the moment of losing my temper, I can't choose my behavior. My behavior's taken over. I'm seeing red. And yes, Alexander teachers do sometimes see red, and perhaps I should only speak for myself, but Alexander teachers don't go around in this blissful condition of non-reaction. That's another myth. That's another myth. It doesn't work like that. But hopefully we might lose it a little bit less and recover a little bit quicker. So the choice of behavior, right now I can choose my behavior to a certain degree. I can choose to lift up a book or put down a book. If I'm having a temper tantrum downstairs with my kids that are chucking things around the house and busting up the kitchen, and I come in there and grab hold of one of them and chuck him out of the window, I'm teasing. Don't believe me on this one. But say I lose the plot, and I'm going in there. Stop fighting! Stop chucking things around the kitchen. I'm not really choosing particularly. I'm overtaken by my emotional gusts, my passions. My passions are winning at those moments. Now, hopefully, after 10 seconds or so, I might just about catch myself. But in the moment I've reacted, I've reacted. There's no choice in the moment of reaction. That is absolutely clear to me in my experience. I may be on an edge, in which case I can sort of, I haven't totally flipped, in which case I haven't totally reacted, and I'm not totally out of choice for behavior. So it depends how close you are to your edge. There's a gray area when I'm a little bit still in control. I haven't totally lost it. I still can choose whether I swear or don't swear. But over the edge, in what Alexander called a reaction to a stimulus or overreaction to a stimulus, by definition, there's no choice available at that moment. I'm in a state of reaction until my system quietens itself down again. And then I can think clearly. And Alexander described this as either in touch with or out of touch with reason. And he said the whole goal of Alexander is to learn to remain in touch with reason, which means that the brain is in gear, not for it to dominate, but in gear, that it's not out of commission, that the brain is available for thought. Not being intellectual, I don't mean that at all, but being available for thought. That when I'm upset and I can actually say to myself, Anthony, you're feeling very sad. I haven't lost it in some huge whale. I'm in touch with my feelings, and that's a safer place to be in touch with my grief and my hopes and my dreams and my disappointments, my frustrations. I'm in touch with my reason. In other words, my mind can make sense of my feelings, and there's a communication between all the centers of my being, my brain thought, my heart thought, and my belly thought. There's like centers of communication that ideally want to communicate. My gut brain, my heart brain, and my cerebral brain. They're all very, very important parts of the personality, which ideally want to communicate backwards and forwards. And if you just put one out of commission, you're not always in the best place. So just working from the heart may be wonderful, but you might get yourself into a bit of a pickle. Sometimes my gut may be accurate or not very accurate. It might need a little bit of reason to assess whether my gut may be telling me something useful or not. And so it's important that all of these parts of our being are integrated. You're all silenced.
We're trying to integrate.
What's that?
We're trying to integrate everything.
You don't have to. So then I can come in and say, actually, it doesn't need to integrate. But there's nothing you need to do about words. They're just words. The most important communication is actually my manner of use while I'm talking. My words are just a load of fluff. They're just wallpaper. So actually nothing needs to be integrated, really, at all. Certainly not the words I'm using.
So hello, Anthony.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. So I have a question about your text. So in the chapter giving directions,
Yes.
so you wrote, he persisted in giving direction despite much evidence that they did not actually work for him. So, but I really don't understand what you want to say. So
Yeah.
in this chapter, so in this sentence. So.
Yes. So this is one of the big conundrums of the Alexander world and has been for many, many, many years. What does Alexander mean by giving directions? Now let's really, all of us, be honest. And I'm sure you are all honest. If you ask yourselves, anyone in your school, how do you give directions? Or you say to a new pupil, I want you to give directions. We all mean the same thing. Do we all really mean the same thing? Well, patently, no, of course we don't. because I've asked thousands of teachers and they all come up with a different version. You know, it's a bit like, you know, for every 2 Jews, you have 3 opinions. And for every 3 Alexander teachers, you have 4 opinions. What do we mean by directions? Well, is it saying words to ourselves? It's one possibility. Is it thinking about the part and the parts in relationship to one another? That's another possibility. Is it energizing the upward direction through the spine? That's another possibility. Is it imaginary words that somehow expand and open and lengthen and widen? That's a possibility. Are they nonsense words where we just mouth them and mean nothing and don't attach any meaning to them because we don't know what they mean and just say neck free, head forwards and up like a mantra? I've heard that one. In other words, we don't agree among ourselves what directions are. And Alexander wasn't very clear about his meaning of directions. They were changing all the time. And which directions? Which language should you give directions in? Is it let the neck be free to let the head go forwards and up? Or is it let the neck be free, let the neck be long, head forwards, head up? Or is it forwards and up, forwards and up, forwards and up, forwards and up, like MacDonald would often say to us? Or is it let, 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 let? Or is it up, 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 up? You know, which one would you like? Well, you could say, well, they're all rather nice, aren't they? You might use different ones at different times. That's okay. So what are the directions? They are just vehicles for shifting the mind-body. There's no right directions. So if you want to use the old formula, well, the old formula's changed all the time. And if you ask the first generation of Alexander teachers which directions, we didn't get the same result. Miss Goldie, Walter Carrington, Marjorie Barlow, Wilfred Barlow, Patrick MacDonald, they all had totally different versions. Miss Goldie, who I was very privileged to have lessons from for many years, would say, not head back, not head back, quiet throughout, but more alert than ever before, not head back. Now, what's that got to do with the formulaic directions, you may ask? Well, the answer is nothing or everything. But what was happening was that she was communicating with her hands and her being what she wanted. The primary communication, going back to what we were talking about right at the beginning of today, was in a way it didn't really matter what her words were. They were just evocations. They were coat hooks to hang her clothes on. It didn't really matter what she said because I was getting the experience from her being, her use of self. So she can say, remain quiet throughout. And yeah, I got that. Not head back. She was quietly placing her hands on me and stopping me going into a flight response. Very nice. Marjorie Barstow, on the other hand, in America, would say, now take your head forwards and up. A little bit, you know, forwards and up, a little bit of doing, just a little bit of doing. Carrington would say it's just a little wish, a wish of neck free, head forwards and up. MacDonald would say it's an energy of uplift in the spine. They all said different things. So let me quote you something. Let me quote you all something, because you did actually ask me a question when you sent me an email. This is from Carrington's book, A Time to Remember. November 1946, Diary of Experiences with Alexander. At tea time, FM said that he had at last decided that we must cut out in future teaching all instructions to order the neck to relax or to be free, because such orders only lead to other forms of doing. What, really? Alexander said that to Carrington? Are you kidding me? Cut out in future all directions for the neck to release, head forwards and up, because those directions lead to other forms of doing. Really? You know, it's worth reading that again. Cut it out in all future teaching, because it leads to other forms of doing. That ask most people, and I'm sure you all know this, sometimes you'll say, let the neck be free, head forwards and up, and you'll get some horrific response. You get this, or you get this, or you get this, or you get this. You'll get a whole load of different things you never dreamed of. You didn't want them, but you said the magic words and it didn't happen. As if the magic words could happen. But the Alexander formulaic directions are not abracadabra. They're just words, and they're not holy. And they're not to be repeated, as if somehow they are magic tricks. Because that bypasses use of the self of the teacher, which is the primary communicator, and the words are secondary. So I'm okay with any words, and I'm okay with no words at all. Because words are simply evocations that connect to a person's nervous system, and they will receive them based on their history, their personality, their imaginations, their creativities, their previous experiences. That there's no such thing as giving the right verbal directions to anybody and have any clarity and certainty about the result of those particular directions. There's no way. And Alexander says here, look, so many times you'll try and send these nice directions, neck free, head forwards and up. And what happens? Well, let me ask you a fundamental question. If you are trying to send directions, what wins? If you try to send directions, what wins? Yes. Trying. And not the directions. Perfect. The trying wins and the directions lose. It's a battle. In any battle between trying and anything nice, the nice loses and the trying wins. Every single time. So let me go on to the second part. If a person's stiffening the neck, the remedy, this is a quote from Alexander, the remedy is to get them to stop projecting the messages that are bringing about the condition. In other words, if there is a stiffening of the neck, there's no point in sending nice messages for the neck to be free. Isn't this brilliant? This is brilliant. Really, buy it. I recommend it to everybody. If someone's stiffening their necks, don't ask them to send nice messages to let the necks be free. It's like, you know, if you feel that you're ugly and you look in the mirror and tell yourself how wonderful you look, it may not quite do the trick. It's sort of covering up something. Maybe you have to actually go deeper into you feel ugly. It's my reality. I need to go into that. I need to explore that, but not cover it up with nice syrup. If your neck is stiff, don't tell yourself that you want a nice free neck and then try and get it, because all you do is try harder to get what you don't have and tell yourself off for not having it and give yourself a rough time and magnify the trying, which only leads to other forms of doing. So here's your question. If the stiffening of the neck is a result of a doing, there's only one solution. And Carrington's telling you what the solution is. Get them to stop projecting the messages that are bringing about this condition in the first place. Get them to quit. How do you do that? Well, you have to know why they're sending the messages in the first place for the neck to stiffen. Okay, so why do we send messages to our necks to stiffen? Not on purpose. You don't go around thinking all day, neck stiff, neck stiff, neck stiff. Yeah. It happens automatically, unconsciously as a habit, right? That's clear. So here's Anthony going around with his stiff neck. Well, I may be a ballet dancer and I've got into this little bit of a, maybe a sergeant major. I may just be rather a rigid personality. I happen to be a rather rigid personality, so I know stiff necks very well. So when I'm doing stiff necks, it's an invitation for me, an invitation for Anthony to say, goodness, Anthony, you're being a little bit arrogant. You're trying really hard to get your point across. I've got to stop sending this message to get my point across so hard. And I can find a way of, you know what, Anthony, I'm not going to get this point across. I may have to stay in this rather vulnerable place of failing to get my point across, to risk moving from this known place of being in control and move towards a place of not being in control of whether you like what I'm saying or not. A very vulnerable place of not knowing the result of my behavior, of not knowing whether you'll agree with me. Because I've now realized that every time I try to make my point and push it at you and try and get you to believe me and agree with me, I'm getting my stiff neck. And the only way I can stop getting my stiff neck isn't going for a massage or tell my neck to be nice and free. That's covering up the cracks. It's to realize deep in my soul that my trying and my fear of not being understood is dominating, and to go through a process of surrendering that control freakness so that I can navigate towards lessening some of my control freakness. And in this unknown territory of not being in control, my neck starts to soften from its habitual efforting and trying and controlling. And this is what I think Alexander meant when he said, look, no point in sending nice directions to yourself. Prevent the projection of messages that are getting you into a pickle in the first place. Now, this is what Alexander said to Carrington in 1946. Now, then you may ask, well, hold on a minute. I don't remember any of that first generation of Alexander teachers saying, quit sending directions because it creates doing. And then you have to ask the question, why? Now, a colleague, a friend of mine, who's an Alexander teacher of many years' experience, went to Walter Carrington with this little chapter and said, look, Walter, you and all the other first generation teachers are telling us to word these directions to ourselves in order, in sequence, one after the other, all together, whatever that means. But here, FM is saying to you, you know what, quit this sending of the directions. What's going on? And Walter said to this teacher, you know what, young man, you are absolutely right, but old habits die hard. Old habits die hard. And that was a very, very honest admission that actually, when these teachers who had been following Alexander's journey from maybe the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and suddenly in 1946, Alexander says, you know what, guys, you can now dish it. You can now dump it in the waste bin of history. Well, it's the same response that I get when I say, you know what, you don't need to give directions. And people look at me and say, well, thanks, Anthony, but what do we do instead? So I don't like to disempower people. So I know that the urge to give something and do something and hold on to something called directions is very, very, well, it's like a drug. It's very, very hard to get rid of. So I understand that even though it looks like Alexander did say, cut it out, it's problematic, that if you give directions to an end gainer, they'll end gain directions and cause stiffening. It's pretty obvious. It was almost impossible after 20, 30 years of doing this thing to do anything else, because he wasn't giving them an alternative. He did say there's an alternative, which is getting them to stop sending them in the first place. How do you do that? How do you stop people sending them? Well, then I think you have to understand, Alexander, the whole process is a psychophysical system of enabling a person to feel safe and vulnerable and come off the very human tendency of being a control freak. And that really is a navigation from what Alexander called the known towards the unknown. It's a very difficult trip, a very, very difficult trip. But I believe that's where the juice is of this work. That's where the juice is. Helping a person navigate from their very confident sense of this is what we do to improve, hit and miss, towards non-doing, which is probably the hardest game in town, because it means going through a whole series of evolutions that don't taste good, that make us feel rather vulnerable, that go against the grain, that are against our usual habits of effort and trying, both individually and as a society and a culture. Very, very tricky. But I do believe at source, the Alexander technique is a technique for prevention rather than a clever technique for doings or better doings, as in it's the neck tightening and going back and down of the head is the problem, and let's teach you a good doing, the head going forwards and up. I don't think that's where the juice is. I think that's a myth. I really think that's a myth. The juice is the head going back and down is a reaction to a stimulus, which is too much for you. Let's see if we can help you handle the stimulus without the terrified head pulling back and down in retreat. Help you handle the stimulus in a way that enables you to sit with or stand with your reality rather than get thrown into mindless, unreasoned reactions. So you're not choosing between two rights here or two wrongs, but actually prevention of the origin of the habit. I'll just read the last part of it. If a person's stiffening the neck, the remedy is to get them to stop projecting the messages that are bringing about this condition, and rather than projecting messages to counteract the effects of the other messages. In other words, don't just send messages to counteract the wrong messages, so-called, as in neck free, head forwards and up, or counteract neck tight, head back and down. No, that's not going to work, he says. And then Alexander goes on to say, he said that the implied contradiction had worried him for a long time. He'd obviously kept it to himself. In 1946, he went public with it. He outed himself. After a long time, and after working with Hallis this morning, he saw that it must be changed, so that all orders in future will be framed so as to emphasize non-doing. So there you have it. There you have it, 1946. Non-doing as the core of the technique to achieve and move towards a condition of non-doing, not another clever doing or a counteracting of the wrongdoing, but non-doing, that state of non-reactions to a stimulus, from the known to the unknown, this rather raw, unbearable place where you don't know where you are. It's not in control, it's not safe, it's not your usual, it's not familiar, it feels wrong. And that's where the juice is. So it's a tricky one, isn't it? You know, we've been, all of us, I've been brought up on traditions of how you get people going right. And the truth is, even if you use the formulaic directions, I'm sure you've all got good enough hands to give the truth anyway, and to give non-doing through your hands and through your being. But maybe it's not a bad idea to not attribute the positive changes to the clever words you're using, but more towards your use of self. That maybe that's why you get the results you get when you're getting good results. Rather than assuming it's the clever words that you're saying at the same time, or the clever words that you're getting them to say. Because I know that so many pupils and students get very confused about directions. And many, many teachers say, you know what, I'm giving these directions and all sorts of strange, weird things are happening. And I wish there weren't, but I've got to give directions, because if I don't give directions, I'm not an Alexander teacher. Well, it's okay, I give you full permission because Alexander gave you full permission not to use formulaic, counteractive directions. You don't have to. If you want to, be my guest. I'm not cutting it out of your repertoire. But two things to remember. Your use of self is the primary communicator, the non-doing attitude, and your being of non-judgmental enveloping of the experience, containing the experience with the other, allowing them to have whatever experience they have, not pushing them into trying harder to please you. These are the groundwork essentials that you communicate from self to other. And what you do, the words or the absence of words, sometimes you might find that working in silence is your best bet, because whatever word you choose with certain sorts of pupils, the pupils will run with those words and imagine goodness knows what. So some solutions for certain sorts of people, maybe just keep your mouth shut and just work. But how can you do that? That's not legitimate, Alexander. Well, of course it's legitimate, Alexander, if you're moving them towards non-doing. All directions can be framed as non-doing. The touch of your hands are directions. They are framed as non-doing. You don't have to try. You don't have to succeed. You don't have to get it right. There's no such thing as wrong. You're okay. It's safe. Those are primary communications that are framed as non-doing. Primary communications. And all the rest are secondary. And you can choose your creative secondary variables as long as you affirm the primary nature of your non-doing. Yeah, feel free to jump in.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything.
Hello, Anthony.
Yes, yes, yeah, I'm here. Okay.
Yeah. I would first say that I really enjoy today's Zoom. I would thank you and Richard also who invited us. Really strong words. Maybe I'm end-gaining too much for all this information.
A desire for information or desire for anything is not end-gaining. In Alexander worlds, end-gaining is used as a term of abuse. You're an end-gainer. So let me be very clear, having goals and desires and wishes and wants to get rid of pain, to grow, to feel healthier, to have better performance, to understand, they're not end-gaining. They're normal, healthy human desires. Absolutely normal and healthy human desires, not to be surgically removed from your repertoire, ever. So first of all, I affirm everything that you want from this, as I affirm everything from myself, what I want in this world. The way we go about achieving these things can be modified in a safe setting. So be my guest, go for it.
Okay, thank you. I would maybe move from these directions and in more Alexander term to your knowledge of the other psychological themes that you also
Yes.
studied,
Yes.
in connection with the Alexander technique, of course.
Yes.
And I'm interested in this psychophysical unity. How do you approach, let's say, for example, with a condition that somebody comes, you release some tension with your hands-on or on the individual lesson, let's say on the shoulder, from stress, whatever. And if you see that the cause is more emotional, how do you go deeper in this psychological or from the psychophysical point, more emphasis on the first word,
Yes.
on the psychological way of.
First of all, I like Alexander's term psychophysical, that it's impossible to separate psychological from physical anyway. So for instance, if you are a musician and you go for an audition and you're frightened because you have to perform well to get the job in an orchestra, and you freeze a little bit, that is psychological and physical. You can't separate out which is one and which is the other. So if I get a stiff shoulder because I'm going for auditions all the time, or I'm playing with a lot of trying for you to understand my music, my expression, it is psychophysical. And it's impossible to say it's 90% physical and 10% psychological. It's always both, which is why Alexander said the self is a psychophysical self and you can't separate. It always is psychophysical. my desire to achieve success in my audition is going to manifest as tension in my face, neck, back, shoulder, because I want to succeed. I want to impress the judges and get the job in an orchestra. Now, it's not, I don't want to release this tension. That's not my job. I leave that to the massage expert and the physiotherapist and the acupuncturist that can stick a needle in. I don't want to compete. I don't want to compete with all these wonderful things that release tension. That is not my job. Otherwise, you'll never have any work if you're just there to release tension. There's plenty of people that can do it much better than us. So I'm not here interested in releasing a shoulder. I'm interested in preventing the shoulder, along with the whole organism, getting into a pickle in the first place. So I raise it as a question. I don't want to release tension in the shoulder on a table or in a chair. But if a person's coming in like this for their first lesson and they're manifesting a certain wanting to please me and wanting to get it right, or afraid of their pain and not able to carry on playing in the orchestra anymore because they've got so much discomfort when they play, my job isn't to go into that shoulder and release it, because guess what? Tomorrow it'll come back again, as Alexander found with his voice. What is my job as an Alexander teacher? My job is to see if I can prevent them repeating this habit of terror and effort and end gaining in the first place. So they come in and I say, look, okay, let's just work. And I say, well, can I direct my shoulder releasing? And I say, no, there's nothing to achieve. You do not have to gain anything in here right now. There's nothing you have to do. You're fine just the way you are. I know you're in discomfort. Everything's okay. Let me do the work. I'll place my hands on and give them the experience of nothing to do, non-doing, nothing to achieve. And I'll move them with this non-doing quality of nothing to achieve, nothing to gain, nothing to try. It's okay. Nothing to fix, nothing to oppose, nothing to stretch. And I work like that for a while, and I mean it. And I do mean this. And after maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, the organism, the mind body will start to go, oh, and I didn't ask the shoulder to release, but the shoulder and the neck and the back and the face and the efforting of the mind and the adrenaline of the nervous system will quietly subside. And the thing that bothered them has sort of disappeared in the process for a while. And I say, no, they might say, goodness, well, how did you release the shoulder? And I say, well, I didn't release the shoulder, but something in you as a whole quietened down. You felt safe enough to not try and adjust yourself and fix it, that the fixing mind had a bit of quiet. And in the process, you allowed the system to open itself up by itself. It has its own intelligence because you came off your own button of trying. And then they have an experience that non-doing is the solution rather than Anthony releasing a shoulder. I don't want them to have an experience that Anthony releases shoulders. It's just the same as going to a massage or an acupuncture needle. Big deal. That doesn't empower anybody. But if they have the experience that as they shifted an attitude, a psychophysical attitude from a trying attitude to an attitude of, oh, so I don't have to fix it after all. This isn't my problem. This isn't my area. This isn't the thing to do. This isn't the fix area. This isn't the big bogeyman and the monster. Oh, I'm okay the way I am. I'm not my own self-fixer. I don't have to try so hard. And the system breathes. They then become empowered to understand that their trying was the problem and their gradual move under your guidance towards non-doing and non-trying is their solution. That's very, very empowering. And it's got nothing to do with symptomatic release of a part, but to do with their whole psychophysical makeup, their whole way of being in the world. But it's always psychophysical, it's always mind-body, it's always general rather than the specifics of a part. With Alexander, it wasn't his throat that was the problem. He thought it was, tried all the throat issues and the throat solutions in the world. The problem was he was end-gaining his need to project his voice from one corner of the auditorium to another corner when he was reciting Shakespeare sonnets. It was his efforting, or his terror, or his freeze, whatever it was his whole being that was participating in this. This was not his problem. Even though he was called the voice man, he was a generalist, or he became a generalist. He thought all at the beginning is all about a good use of voice, but the use of self is the term. It's not use of voice. We don't use voices, we use ourselves, and the voice is a manifestation of use of self. Never the other way around. We don't use bodies. There's no use of body. There's use of the self. And in fact, one of the questions that you guys sent me in the email was, is a knowledge of psychology or therapy or counseling necessary? And it really begs the question, on an Alexander training course, most of us seem quite comfortable in studying anatomy and physiology and necks and backs and bones and muscles and tendons, and we want to know where the neck starts and the neck stops and the head joins and the atlanto-occipital areas, and we want to know about the psoas and the fascia. We want to know about all of these wonderful physiological mechanisms and the breathing and how it works, and we want to know about the digestive system. And you all want to be doctors, and you should have been doctors with that sort of thinking. But when people suggest, hey, maybe you need to understand a little bit about how human beings operate psychologically, that actually when you're under attack, you go into a flight, fright, freeze situation, that maybe you want to understand the basics of therapeutic systems, of non-judgmentalness, compassion, not making a person feel wrong, to inquire rather than to advise. People think, oh, that's straying into psychology, but we're just Alexander teachers. Well, if you're just Alexander teachers, why is one side of the psychophysical spectrum totally kosher and another side of the psychophysical spectrum a little bit dubious? I mean, you're either psychophysical generalists or you're not. Make up your mind. If you're just glorified body workers, then you can call yourself physiotherapists. But Alexander technique teachers, I assume, like to see themselves as psychophysical experts, in which case the psychological essence of being human is just as valid as knowing where your atlanto-occipital joint is. By the way, I should add here that I don't think it matters a toss where your atlanto-occipital joint is, and I don't think you need to know anything about it. Because actually, it's not something you need to know about any more than you need to know anything about your breath. I hope I'm not being overly provocative here, but the system knows everything it needs to know, and your job is to get out of its way. It's much cleverer than you and me. That the little new cortex, the neocortex, does not need to be participating in biology. You do not need to work out how to walk or how to run. You do not need to work out how to digest or when to blink. You do not need to work out when to smile or not smile unless the camera is about to click. You do not need to work out the relationship of your neck, head, and back, because it's biologically endowed as part of your animal brain, the old brain. So I think what you do need to know is what it means to be a human being and what it means when you're evoking fear with another human being. I think that's much more important than knowing about the intricacies of your ankle joint, as if you need to know anything about that stuff, or what capsulitis is, how your shoulder articulates, or your rib cage, or the mechanisms of mobility, movement. I just don't think you need to know any of that stuff, really. But perhaps you do need to know what it means to be a human being in relationship, because you are working with a human being. And maybe you need to know, if you said, well, what side of the psychophysical unity would be valuable? I'd need to say, well, when you are traumatized, as we often have been as children, we go into compensatory mechanisms of flight, fight, freeze, or despair. That we need to know that these are psychophysical realities, and know we need to understand the psychophysical unity, that we are always operating as psychophysical beings. That for me is valuable. That stiff necks and rigid spines are not anatomical problems in and of themselves. They are psychophysical realities as a result of being human and often facing life or early experience challenges. And it's our job to help the mechanism heal itself, rather than know the intricacies of the bones and joints and muscles and tendons and ligaments and fascia, which, to be honest, all the knowledge in the world will not help you be Alexander teachers, because that's not where the magic is. It's not in detailed knowledge. It's in creating an environment of non-judgmental safety, where the system is encouraged and invited to heal itself psychophysically. Okay, good.
Okay,
Good.
Well, thanks, Anthony. You're really, really interesting.
Thank you for your attentive faces. It's always nice to sit opposite attentive faces rather than faces that are going to sleep. So thank you for keeping me alive and engaged, and look forward to seeing you hopefully in person sooner rather than later. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Take care.
much.
Thanks for inviting
Thank you.
me.
Bye.
Thanks for the invitation.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you.